Hey everybody, welcome back to Cityscape Brewing. I'm Dennis Fields. Today we're going to be brewing an extract kit, going through the step-by-step directions if you're new to brewing or if you're a brewer that's just getting started into the hobby, or maybe you haven't gotten to the hobby and you were wondering about what it takes to get started. This video is for you. So with that, grab yourself a home brew, hit that subscribe button. We'll be back after this. All right, so we have our all grain kit here. We've ordered, it's came in. We're gonna go ahead and unbox this thing, and then we're gonna talk about some of the equipment that you'll need to do your brew day completely from start to finish. And so you wanna make sure you have everything on hand, equipment and ingredients wise, before you get started. So let's go ahead and get this box open first. So in this case, we're gonna be brewing a Northern Brewer Chinook IPA extract kit. Let's see what we got inside. So this thing came in the mail in just a few days from them. It's got our recipe guide and step-by-step instructions in here for you. So we'll go through this to a T during this video just so you can do it exactly how I do it and how the instructions are supposed to do it so your beer turns out awesome. It's also going to send you some yeast. When you get this, whether you get a liquid version or if you get a powder version like this one, you'll want to put this in the refrigerator. That's going to help it keep cold before brew day. Unless you're brewing that same day, I would suggest putting that in the refrigerator, and then the day of your brewing, pull it out so it can warm up. I've already done that, but we're going to let this sit out for the rest of the day because we're brewing it today. The other things that are in here are hops, and you'll probably have several additions, but some kits only have a few ounces, some have a lot, so it depends how much. In this case, we have 3 ounces, I believe, of Chinook hops. Yeah, they're all 3 1-ounce packages. I went ahead and when I opened this originally and put these in the freezer. They stay longer in the freezer, especially when they're vacuum packed like this, and so go ahead and throw those in the freezer. But we can leave them out today because we're gonna be brewing today. So we have our hops, we have our yeast. They also give you a small bag of grains, and this is gonna be your specialty grains. That's gonna give your beer the color that the beer desires, because you're not gonna be doing an all grain kit where you have all grains. Instead, you'll have a little bit of grains like this that'll help give the color to the beer. And then that comes with a little muslin bag that we pour these into, and we steep these grains so it gives the color to the beer before we start our full boil. So we'll set that off to the side. No need to refrigerate or do anything special with either of these two. And then you'll have 1 or 2 different kinds of extract malt, okay? This is dry extract malt, or DME as it's called. So that's short for dry malt extract, of course. And so this one is a Pilsen Light dry malt extract. And then you may also have a liquid or a syrup malt extract, sometimes called LME for liquid malt extract. The day that you brew, I would suggest soaking this in your sink with some warm water. That's gonna help get this thing loosened up a little bit from the sides. It'll help pour out a little easier. Pro tip there, you don't have to do that, but it is very helpful. You may also get a package of sugar in there. It's called priming sugar, and that priming sugar is going to help you carbonate in bottles. In this case, I'm going to be actually kegging this at the end of the day, but I do have a video on how to bottle all of your beer, so you can go ahead and check that out. But the priming sugar is for bottling day, so you might also have one of those. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the equipment that you're gonna need starting off. The first one being something to brew in. So some of you may have a small kettle that you'll do on your stovetop, and then you'll add water at the end of your brew to bring it up to 5 gallons. Some of you can choose to do a bigger pot and do it all in one and boil down to the volume that you need at the end of the day. When I first started brewing, I didn't want to do it in the house. I wanted to do it in my garage, and I wanted to do full boils even though I was doing extract brewing. So I opted to get a 10-gallon pot right away, but either way, it's the exact same process. So don't feel discouraged if you do it in your house. Maybe you live in an apartment, you don't have a place to do it outside. Totally fine, you can do this on your stove. So if you have a smaller pot, I would suggest at least getting a 5-gallon pot that you can do inside, and make sure that it fits on your stove, that kind of thing. But you can do it even a little bit smaller. It'll just be a condensed batch until you add water at the end to bring it up to that 5-gallon mark. And in my case, I'm going to be using my normal brew kettle, like this one. This is a 10-gallon, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna start with 6 gallons of water, and we're gonna brew down to 5 gallons, and it may even be a little bit less than 5 gallons, and at the end we'll add some water back to it to make sure that it hits that 5-gallon mark. I'll have any equipment and stuff that we need in the link description below, so if you're interested and look at the products that I use directly, those will be available to you. The next thing you're gonna want to look at is water. So we brew with a lot of water. When I first got started, I actually used spring water, and this is a good alternative for people just getting started. So I would go out and I would buy 6 gallons of this, maybe 7, just to make sure that I had enough after my brew day. And these are about $1 a piece or even less at the grocery store. You can go ahead and get spring water. You do not want to use distilled water because it doesn't have any mineral content in it. So don't use distilled water. The drinking water may be okay, but I would opt for the spring water. Spring water does not have chlorine in it, and it has mineral content in it already, which is great for brewing. So when in doubt, grab spring water. In a pinch, you could use drinking water, but then you're also gonna have to get rid of the chlorine, and we'll talk about that too. Alternatively, for extract brewing, it's not important to add any mineral content to it if you're using regular tap water. However, again, you'll want to filter that water, and you'll also want to get rid of the chlorine. I use an inline water filter like this on my hose. I have a special hose just for home brewing, and then I put this one on there. But if you used a regular garden hose, it's not that big of a deal. Some people say don't use those, but the minimal amount of water as it's flowing through isn't picking up anything bad, and this thing is a filter, so it catches any debris and junk that might be in your hose anyway. So I go ahead and I just use this from the regular hose spigot outside. You fill up your water with this, and then this will take out some of the chlorine. It also takes out any of the just regular deposits and stuff that might be in the water. Then I add Campden tablets, which is what you would also do if you use drinking water. These you can buy at your homebrew supply store. I also have a link down in the video description. These take the chlorine out of your water, so you'll want to use these as well if you're using something that has chlorine in it. Spring water will not, so that's an option for you. You're also going to need a temperature gauge like this one. Most people will get this in their kit. If you order like a kit from Northern Brewer, for instance, like the one in my description below, you'll have this. My pot actually has temperature gauge on it, so I don't need one of these, but these are very common, especially if you're brewing inside on your stove. You'll stick this on the lip, and then you'll be able to see for when we steep our grains and boil what the temperature of your water is. Next, you'll need, to be able to clean and sanitize all of your equipment, you'll need some cleaner and some sanitizer. I use both PBW, and more often than not, I use this free and clear OxyClean. It's the ones with no dyes or perfumes in it, that kind of thing. This eats all the protein and stuff off. I use this for cleaning out, I mean, everything, kegs and carboys and buckets and you name it, I clean it with this one. When in doubt, I will use some PBW if it's really stuck on there and stuff, but OxyClean, a much cheaper alternative for that as well. And then I use the Star San. This is the lighter bottle. They have a darker color, does kind of the same thing, but I think it needs a little bit more contact. You'll want to sanitize all of your equipment that you're going to use after your boil, right? So make sure your pot and stuff is clean and things that you're going to use during your boil, but no need to sanitize it because you're going to be boiling that stuff. So you don't need to go ahead and put sanitizer on it. Only the things that after you get done boiling, anything that touches your beer after that, we'll need to make sure it goes through sanitization. So go ahead and make sure you have all that stuff on hand. And last but not least, you're also going to need something to read your gravity when we get done, so you can kind of see where you hit your mark. This is optional, but I suggest doing that. Some of your kits already have a floating hydrometer like this one. This one is a hydrometer. You'd fill this tube up, you'd take this hydrometer out, you'd fill this up with beer, and then you'd spin the hydrometer in there, and it has a gravity reading on this stick part here, where you would read your original gravity, which is before you ferment it, and then afterwards you would use this, and the difference will tell you ABV of your beer, and then also tell you that it's done fermenting. So that a lot of times will come in a kit. Sometimes they do not come with this extra test tube here that will help float your things in there, but it may. Alternatively, before your fermentation is done, you can use a refractometer. This does the same thing. You put just a few drops of it though, instead of having to fill up this whole tube, put a few drops of this on this little plate here, you close it, you look through, it gives you your starting gravity or Brix reading. This one has both. It gives you that right away. And so the good news is this spends, or you only need a little bit of some of your wort to drip on here. You don't need to fill up this whole thing, just waste a little less wort at the beginning. But you can't use this after fermentation is complete because there's alcohol present, and so this will be skewed a little bit because of the alcohol. There are calculators online that you can kind of figure that out still, but post fermentation I just always use my regular floating hydrometer. So these are some optional things. You don't necessarily need to have a hydrometer at all after the fermentation action is done. There's no need to necessarily read all of this stuff, but it really helps you know when fermentation is done, and the only way to tell is using a hydrometer. So next we're gonna go ahead and start the brew day process. We'll go through it step by step as if you were gonna do it on your stove, but in my case I'm just gonna do it on an outdoor burner. And we're gonna do that full boil and boil it down, but all of the steps will be exactly identical. So we're gonna go through and do that step by step all the way until we pitch our yeast. All right, we're gonna add our Camden tablet and add 6 gallons of water. All right, so we have our 6 gallons of water. Whether you chose to do your spring water, put 6 gallons in there, or you're doing it on your stovetop, added your initial amount of water. In this case, we used the filter, and then I added a Camden tablet to get rid of the chlorine. Go ahead and do that. They gave us this muslin bag for our steeping grains. In this case, the bag says our grain blend, and this is cracked malt essentially. It's going to give us the color of the beer. So what I like to do is open the top of this bag and then put the whole sack around it so it's easier to pour. So then I'll take it like, you know, like a sock and put it over the whole top of the bag like this. And then I'm going to put it over the pot in case some things fall through. We want it to get in there. And then I'll just kind of carefully lift the bag out by shaking it a little bit, and then it'll keep all of my grains in the sack. Then we're going to go ahead and tie this. And you don't want this to touch the burner on the bottom. So what a lot of times I'll do is I'll tie this to the handle or use a clip. And in this case, I'll probably use a clip because you do want it to be suspended. And so sometimes you actually have to take a little bit of a string and actually get it down into the water. But what we're gonna wanna do is we're gonna wanna start our burner and get this brewing up to 170 degrees while I'm steeping. And then we're gonna take these grains out once it hits that level. So this will allow that color to get in there. And then we're gonna pull our grains once it gets to that 170 degree mark. All right, once you have your steeping grains in there, you can go ahead and start the burner and wait until it hits 170 degrees. Don't forget to add your temperature gauge. Don't forget the first rule of home brewing, always enjoy a home brew while home brewing. Cheers. You should start noticing this nice color that's coming in from the steeping of the grains. You're gonna, lift that up, stir around it, a little bit. Get that liquid moving around and get all that colory goodness, sugary goodness out of the steeping grains. All right, our grains have hit the 170 degree mark. I've got this extra bag here. I'm gonna go ahead and get them to drain out. Let all the liquid fall out of the bottom of that bag there, and then when it's done, put them in this bag. We're gonna continue heating this up until boiling, but we wanna pull these grains out of the liquid because they have all of the color they're gonna give off. And from here on out, we'll just have our sugary water in here. And once it gets to a boil, we're gonna turn that down and add our LME and DME, so our liquid malt extract and our dry malt extract. All right, it is just about to our brewing or our boiling stage. I'm going to go ahead and add just a couple of drops here, about 1/4 of a teaspoon or so of firm cap, and this will help prevent boilovers in your beer. This is really important if you are doing this on a stove, and so as it approaches boiling, you're going to want to keep an eye on this. Anytime you add malt extract or hops, or as it gets close to brewing, even after you're steeping grains, it can boil over, so you want to be really careful of that. I have a lot of extra room in this pot, but you may not if you're doing this inside on your stove. All right, we've got this up to a pretty rapid boil. This is where we add our DME and LME, but before you do that, it is important in extract brewing to shut off the gas or your heat source. In this case, if you're using like an electric burner in your house, go ahead and turn that off and actually move the kettle to a different area where it's not hot anymore. This is important so you don't burn the liquid extract or the dry malt extract, because it will kind of sink to the bottom. We'll add the dry malt extract first. I'm going to go ahead and cut this bag open. We're going to add a little bit at a time, stirring it the whole way, and then we will add our liquid malt extract. So we'll add a little bit, go ahead and stir that in real good, a little bit at a time. And make sure that when you're stirring against the bottom, so if anything goes straight to the bottom, you get that off so it doesn't burn. I've done this a couple of times, adding this when the flame is on or where you have it on a heat source. Number one, it's hard to control the boiling over sometimes, and sometimes it gets stuck on the bottom and burn real quickly. So I just found it easier just to completely shut off your heat source and add all of this. It will get a little clumpy if it's all the steam coming out of the bag too, so just be aware of that. So make sure you get that all good and mixed up. The dry will kind of clump up. Make sure you get all those clumps out of there with your paddle or spoon. Sticks to the side like this, make sure you get all that off. All right, next we're going to add our liquid malt extract. Don't worry if there's a couple of little small clumps on the top of your dry malt extract, not a big deal. I went ahead and took the foil cap off the top of this, so I'm just going to go ahead and dump this in. Again, put a little bit in. It's really sticky and syrupy, and then make sure you're really getting the bottom scraped as you do this, because this liquid it's colder, it's going to go straight down. So I like to stir it as I'm kind of adding it a little bit at a time. It should be warmed up a little bit from you warming it in your sink potentially, as we talked about at the beginning. Go ahead and just keep stirring this stuff in a little bit at a time. Make sure you're really scraping that bottom. This sugar is basically like a sugar syrup, and this is essentially, after we get done pouring all of this in, is the product you would have from all grain brewing when you get done doing your mash and sparge process. And so it rinses all that sugary mixture after your mash gets done, and you get it into your boil kettle. It'll convert sugars or starches, from the grains into sugars, and you end up with what is in this kettle, which is basically a bunch of sugar water with coloring that's on the malt. And now we have what we call wort, W-O-R-T, wort. So I'm going to go ahead and just let this kind of drain in. And then once this is done, we're going to bring this back up to a boil, and be careful, because again, this will boil up. And you want to keep an eye on this. You may need to turn off the burner again, or you may need to turn it down, but make sure it does not boil over as it reaches that boiling point. So we'll go ahead and get the gas kicked back on here. All right, so now we got our gas back on. Make sure that you continually stir it, make sure it's all good and mixed up. Once you're sure that it's all mixed up, you don't have to continuously stir it, but I would keep an eye on it until it gets up to boiling. Because we added the DME and LME, it did drop the temperature about 12 degrees, so it's gonna heat back up to boiling. And then we will add our first hop addition which is the Chinook hops, 1 ounce for 60 minutes. So once it gets up to a boil and we're sure it's not going to boil over again, we'll go ahead and add our first ounce of hops. All right, we are just now starting to get to a pretty good rolling boil here. So this is where you're going to want to pay attention. The wort has now got a lot more sugar and starches and stuff in it, and from the DME and LME we added, the firm cap should really help. And as you can tell, they're not getting a lot of that really foamy looking bubbles in there, but you can, especially if you don't have firm cap. So as it starts getting more and more aggressive boil, you'll want to turn that down a little bit. You still want it to be a pretty aggressive boil, whether it's on your stovetop or outside, just like it's basically what it's doing now. But you don't want it to be boiling so hard that you're constantly getting boilovers. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of stir this around a little bit, make sure that it's not going to be any more of a problem. Because we added that firm cap, I think we're pretty good. See how that foam starts coming up a little bit? The firm cap is really keeping that down, but you may have more of a problem if you don't have it. So not 100% necessary. You can manage it, and usually after the first few minutes of it doing it, it goes down and you don't have to worry about it after that. But right as it starts to boil and when you add hops, you'll want to check that out. So you can tell now it's starting to get a little bit. I'm actually going to turn down the gas just a little bit. So we just continue it being at a pretty good boil, rolling boil, but not so aggressive that we're getting that foam all the time. All right, and now's where we start our 60-minute timer. We've got a full rapid boil going. It is now time for us to add our first hop addition. In this case, we're going to be adding 1 ounce of our Chinook hops. So we're going to go ahead and add those now. We're going to pour those right in. I usually use a hop spider. In this case, I'm not going to, because most of you probably won't be going to. If you have one, great. I'm just going to go ahead because there's only 2 ounces of hops in this, and then 1 dry ounce. It's not that much. We'll go ahead and filter those out at the end, and I'll show you how I do that with the screen. But in this case, just go ahead and pour those right in. So sprinkle those in, and then again, make sure you're watching, because you see what happens here. You'll get that foaming action again, and you'll want to really give that a stir. But man, it smells good when you first add those hops in. But we've started our 60-minute timer now, and the next time that we have to add hops isn't until 10 minutes done, or 10 minutes until the end of our boil. So we're going to let this actually go for 50 minutes, and then right 10 minutes before the boil is supposed to be done, I'm going to be back. We're going to add a 1/2 ounce, so half of one of those bags of the Chinook hops. In this case, I have a scale to weigh that out. If not, just kind of eyeball about what half is in that package. And then we're going to add the other half right at the end of our boil. I think it said 1 minute till the end of the boil. And then we're going to go ahead and shut that off and start cooling down. But I'll be back when it is 10 minutes to the end of our boil. One optional thing that you can do in your boil is add a Warflock tablet. This is going to be added in the last 15 minutes of my boil, so just before we do our next hop addition. In this case, Warflock tablet is like Irish moss. It helps clarify the beer, and so it'll help drop out particulate matter and give you a cleaner looking, clear beer at the end of the day. So definitely optional, but I add these in most of my beers except for hazies and sours that I want more of that hazier appearance. All right, we are at the 15-minute mark. I'm going to go ahead and add my Warflock tablet, throw that guy right in there, and give it a good stir up. All right, we are at the 10-minute mark here, and we're going to go ahead and add our 1/2 ounce. So remember, it's not the whole packet, a half of the packet of Chinook hops. So 10 minutes to the end of the boil, half an ounce of Chinook. Go ahead and give that a good stir up. All right, we are almost down to our last minute. I got a couple of minutes yet of the boil. I'm about to add my last 1/2 ounce of Chinook hops, and then we're going to start cooling this down as quickly as we can to 80 degrees or less. And so realistically, I'd like to be at pitching temperature during our cooling process. Sometimes in the summer months, if you're using a wort chiller through just a garden hose or something else, or even your tap, sometimes it takes a little while to get down. I recommend using a fermentation chamber. Those that are new at brewing probably won't have one. I have a video on how to make one if you're interested in doing that, but keep it in the coldest place that you possibly can. So cooling it down in a sink using ice and water, making sure that you're stirring both the wort and the water around it so it cools down as quickly as we can. we want to try and limit the amount of time just to get that down so no bacteria gets in there before we pitch our yeast. We want our yeast doing the job, not any foreign bacteria that could harm the beer. So I'm using a wort chiller. We're going to go ahead and pitch this right now. We're right at that 1 minute mark. So the 1/2 ounce of Chinook hops going in. And then I'm going to shut this off here in just a second, and we're going to start cooling it down with my wort chiller. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get my wort chiller turned on. I'm going to put it right inside the beer. And then this is going to get kind of hot because one of the sides is going in as cool, the other side's coming out as hot, so I still use my hot pad, and I'm going to kind of rock it back and forth in here as quickly as I can. We want to get that temperature out of here as fast as possible. You'll also want to have your temperature gauge inside of here. I have a temperature gauge on the front of this kettle that I'm going to keep an eye on, and we would want to stop this preferably if it hits 70 degrees or less. Ideally, if it's under 80 degrees, we can start transferring it to our fermenter and it'll cool down as we transfer it a little bit too. But if you don't have a fermentation chamber, you want to get as cold as possible now so we don't have to wait to pitch our yeast. All right, our wort is cooled down to about 80 degrees, a little bit less actually. We're gonna go ahead and transfer this into our fermenter. In this case, I'm using a big mouth bubbler glass carboy. You may be using a bucket, that's just fine. Make sure with whatever you're using that you're able to see how much volume you have. In my case, I know how much volume I have because I can see it on the inside of my kettle here. So I am right at the 5 gallon mark. So that's typical that you would boil off about a gallon of water in that hour boil time frame. That's why we start with 6 so we can boil down to 5. In some cases it's a little bit less, but I'm right at the 5 gallon mark, so I'm happy with that. I'm gonna go ahead and transfer this into my carboy, and I'm using this screen to do 2 things. We didn't use a hop spider in this case, so it's gonna help catch that hop particles that are in the bottom of the kettle here because we just threw them in during the boil process. As this fills up, this screen fills up, I'm actually gonna dump them into this bag I have here, and then it'll allow me to keep going with because I'm gonna try to get those hot particles out. You can also transfer it right into the carboy and let those settle out. I like to get the hops out of there. That's why a lot of people use hop spiders, but that's personal preference. So we're gonna go ahead and do this. It's also gonna help aerate the beer at the same time, which you need air as a good ingredient in your fermentation process. So we're gonna go ahead and open this up. And again, you're gonna catch a lot of this hot particle right away, so you don't wanna open it up fully. And in some people's case, you may be using a kettle that does not have a spigot, which is just fine. If you don't have one, you would just dump some in. I have a bigger strainer that I used when I used a bucket. And then I would just dump that right into the bucket from there. So as you can tell, this screen has helped aerating the beer as it's dumping in there. So we get a lot of oxygen in the wort. That'll help when we pitch our yeast and during fermentation. After fermentation, you want to limit the amount of oxygen, but for now we want that as part of the initial phase of fermentation. All right, I kind of want to show you what this looked like after I got done dumping this in the carboy, and so you might not be able to see this in the bucket, but there's kind of 3 distinct areas. So we dumped this in, we aerated it real good, so that's why the bubbles are up here at the top. I haven't screwed this down completely, but I spilled a little bit and I had to take my harness off so I could clean it off. But basically, you can see all the break in the clear liquid, and then the Werflock tablet's already going to work and separating some of those particulates in the bottom. We haven't pitched our yeast yet. It's just a smidge high, so I'm gonna put this in my fermentation chamber. If you were doing this at home, you would wanna make sure that this is cooled down to pitching temperature before you pitch your yeast. And so whether that be putting it in a little ice bath longer, after you put it in your bucket, if it's still a little hot, you need to make sure that this is down to pitching temperature. My beer here is still right around 78-ish or so, and I'd want to make sure that this is cooled down to where I'm going to ferment at. And in this case, when it's in my fermentation chamber, I'm going to ferment this at 67. US05, when we pitch this yeast, which we'll show you in just a moment, recommends a pitching temperature ideally between 59 and 71.6 degrees, but it can handle 53 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. But again, I want to get it between 59 and 71. That's the ideal temperature, and that's where you're going to have the least amount of off flavors in your beer. And so go ahead and get that cooled down to the right temperature, and then we'll show you how to pitch your yeast. All right, we are down to the final stage. Our beer is cooled down to about 70 degrees right now. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get a little sample for my refractometer. In this case, if you're using I only need a few drops out of a medicine dropper like this. If you are using a hydrometer, you would want to get a hydrometer reading. You could have done that before now as it's cooling down. And then I'm going to go ahead and pitch my yeast. I sanitized a pair of scissors, and I sanitized the packet of yeast that you've gotten. That's very important to do before you cut it open so you don't introduce bad bacteria. And I'm going to go ahead and pitch our US05 by just shaking it gently over the top. And I'm going to kind of let that sit for just a few minutes. I'm going to gently put the cover on. And then I'm going to come back in a couple of minutes, and I'm just going to vigorously shake this. And you could do this again when it's in a bucket. So I'm going to go ahead and put this on here. And then, when I come back in a few minutes, I'm just going to take those handles and just kind of rock it back and forth, get that yeast all in there. So it's going to help kind of rehydrate it while it's sitting on the top. And then go ahead and just shake it so it gets suspended in the beer. And then we're done. All right, guys, we got one more thing to do here real quick. We are going to do our refractometer reading. That's going to tell us our original gravity to start the beer fermentation process. So we're going to put a few drops here with our medicine syringe on this refractometer plate. And we'll look through there. The box said that the original gravity is supposed to be at 1.053, and we are at 1.054, so almost right on the money. All right, so I'm super happy with where that ended up. We're only 1 point off of where we should have been, and I think that just has to do with the volume. If you are using a bucket instead of a glass fermenter, or you are doing it on your stove and it's only 2.5 gallons in your brew kettle to start, what you would do is you'd put it in your bottling bucket, and the markings on the side then you would fill up with your spring water all the way up into that 5-gallon mark. You'd give that a good stir around, and then you'd do your hydrometer, or in this case our refractometer reading, and that would give you your original gravity. So don't do it before you add your volume, do it after you add your volume up to that 5-gallon mark. So after about a week, your primary fermentation is going to be complete. And when that gets done, we're going to go ahead and transfer to a secondary, and that's when you add your last ounce of dry hopping. I have a whole video on how to transfer to a secondary. I'll put that in the link description or the video description below. But you should be at, and you'd want to do a hydrometer reading at that, your final gravity should be right around 1.012 or maybe even 1.010, so 1010, 1012, somewhere around that range. What I like to do is, you'll notice that the big krausen head that's happening during fermentation will have completely dropped out. It will be very little, if any, bubbles on the top. You'll see some residual stuff along the sides and even on the top of the beer floating around, but there'll be very little to no airlock activity, and then that krausen will have really dropped. So I like to give it a couple of extra days. If you still think there's a lot of activity going on, there's no reason to rush it. So go ahead and just leave that for a couple of extra days. Then you'll use your transfer equipment, or if your bucket has a siphon or a spigot on it, you'll just use either an auto siphon or a hose to transfer to a different vessel. And in this case, it could be a glass carboy again, it could be another bucket, doesn't matter. Then during that time, I use a small paint strainer bag, and I sanitize that, and I put my dry hops in that. You don't have to do that, but it helps from sucking those up into your final packaging when you either transfer to a bottling bucket or eventually your keg. If you're bottling your beer, you'll have that priming sugar. You're going to use that after primary fermentation and secondary fermentation gets done. You're gonna mix that with 2 cups of water and it'll be about 2/3 cups of that priming sugar. You're gonna boil that together. You're gonna mix it together, bring it to a boil and stop it. Then you're gonna pour that mixture into your bottling bucket and rack your beer from your secondary into your bottling bucket. Then you're gonna go ahead and just bottle like normal. And so that's going to help carb up your beer because there'll be a little bit of residual yeast left in the beer, and that priming sugar will help create CO2, and that's what carbonates your beer in your bottles. Also very important to go ahead and get all of your equipment and stuff cleaned up right away. I know it might be late on a Friday night or something and you just want to go ahead and go to bed and worry about it in the morning. Not a good idea. It's more stuck on, it's harder to clean. That's just not a good idea. Go ahead and as soon as your brew day is complete, get all of your stuff cleaned up as best as you can. At least getting it rinsed off, and you don't have to necessarily spot clean everything, but getting all of the hot particles and everything off of your wort chiller and out of your kettle and everything else is just gonna help keep your equipment clean. And that's probably one of the more important things to do in home brewing. It's a lot of cleaning and sanitizing, but it's for a reason, so you don't ruin a whole batch of beer after working all day at brewing it. Again, this was really fun for me to do. I haven't done an extract brew kit in years. Hopefully after you get a few brews underneath your belt, maybe you take the plunge into all grain. I have a longer, more in-depth video on how to do that step by step. After you get done doing the mash process, the process is exactly the same for an extract kit if you're doing full boils in a larger kettle like we did today. So I hope you learned something. Feel free to ask questions, comments. Don't be ashamed to ask questions. I love them. Put them down in the video description below. I'd be happy to get back with you and help you out become a better brewer. Please like, subscribe, and share to my channel. That way you get future videos as I post them. Helps out my channel tremendously. I'll have all of the equipment and things that we use down in the link description and the video description. As always, happy brewing and cheers.